Poland, a land of rivers, plains, and quiet villages stretched across the heart of Europe, a place that at first glance feels deeply rooted, stable, ancient, unchanged. But beneath that surface lies a genetic story that is anything but simple. Because the first farmers who ever lived in what is now Poland may not have been who we thought they were. For decades, historians believe they understood the origins of Europe's early farming communities. The story seemed clear. Farming spread slowly from the Near East into Europe, carried by peaceful migrants who introduced agriculture to hunter-gatherers already living across the continent. And Poland? It was just another stop along that journey. But now, ancient DNA is rewriting that story. What scientists have discovered is surprising and in some ways deeply unsettling to long-held assumptions. The earliest farmers in Poland were not just simple migrants bringing seeds and livestock. They were part of something much bigger, a wave of movement that reshaped the entire genetic structure of Europe. And even more surprising, those early farmers didn't remain unchanged. They mixed, they adapted, and in some cases, they disappeared. So the question is no longer just where farming came from. The real question is this: who were Poland's ancient farmers really? Were they direct descendants of the first agricultural pioneers from Anatolia? Did they mix with the hunter-gatherers already living in the region? Or were they eventually replaced by entirely new populations? Because if you follow the DNA, the story becomes far more complex than anyone expected. In this video, we're going to walk through that story step by step. We'll explore who the first farmers in Poland were, where they came from, how they lived, what happened when they encountered local hunter-gatherers, and how later migrations reshaped everything again. We'll also look at what modern genetic research, especially ancient DNA, reveals about their legacy today. And by the end, you'll understand why the genetic origin of Poland's ancient farmers is one of the most surprising discoveries in European history. But to understand any of this, we have to go back much further than farming. Back to a time when Poland wasn't farmland at all, it was wilderness. Long before fields of wheat, before villages, before the idea of farming even existed, the land we now call Poland was home to a completely different kind of people, hunter-gatherers. To understand Poland's ancient farmers, you first have to understand who was already there. Because they weren't arriving into empty land, they were entering a world that had been inhabited for thousands of years. At the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, much of northern Europe, including Poland, was just beginning to become habitable again. Glaciers that had covered vast parts of the continent started to retreat. Forests slowly spread across the landscape. Rivers formed, animals returned, and humans followed. These early inhabitants were part of what scientists call Western hunter-gatherers. They lived in small, mobile groups, moving with the seasons, following herds, fishing rivers, and foraging for wild plants. Their lives were not easy, but they were deeply adapted to their environment. Genetically, they were very different from most modern Europeans. Ancient DNA shows that these hunter-gatherers often had darker skin tones, even while some carried genes for lighter eye colors, including blue. That alone challenges a common assumption that European-looking features have always existed in Europe. They haven't. Those traits came later. And that's important, because it tells us something fundamental. The genetic identity of Europe, including Poland, has been shaped by waves of change, not stability. Now imagine this landscape: dense forests, wild animals, small human groups scattered across vast territory. For thousands of years, this was Poland. No farms, no cities, no permanent settlements, just hunter-gatherers living in balance with nature. But that balance wouldn't last forever, because far to the southeast, a revolution was already underway, a transformation so powerful that it would eventually reach Poland and change everything. The invention of farming, and with it, a completely new kind of human society. While hunter-gatherers were moving through the forests of what is now Poland, something revolutionary was happening far to the southeast. In a region we now call Anatolia, humans were beginning to change their relationship with nature. Instead of following animals, they started controlling them. Instead of gathering wild plants, they began growing their own. This was the birth of agriculture. And it didn't just change how people lived, it changed who they were. Farming allowed populations to grow rapidly. Settlements became permanent, societies became more structured, and over time, these early farmers began to expand. Slowly at first, then steadily, then relentlessly. Over the course of several thousand years, these farming communities moved out of Anatolia and into Europe. They followed river valleys, crossed mountains, and spread across the continent in waves. This wasn't just cultural diffusion, this was migration, real people moving, settling, and bringing their DNA with them. By around 7,500 to 7,000 years ago, these early farmers reached Central Europe.
And eventually, they entered the territory of modern Poland. This moment marks one of the most important turning points in European history, because for the first time, two very different human worlds collided. On one side, the hunter-gatherers, mobile, isolated, deeply adapted to wild environments. On the other, the farmers, settled, expanding, carrying entirely new technologies, new lifestyles, and new genes. So what happened when they met? For a long time, archaeologists thought the answer was simple. They believed farming spread mainly through ideas, that local hunter-gatherers gradually adopted agriculture from their neighbors. But ancient DNA tells a different story, a much more dramatic one. When scientists began analyzing the genetic material from early farming skeletons found across Europe, including Poland, they discovered something striking. These early farmers were genetically very different from the hunter-gatherers already living there. In fact, they were closer genetically to modern populations from the Near East than to the local European hunter-gatherers. Which means this wasn't just an exchange of knowledge, it was a population movement, a large one. The first farmers in Poland were not descended from the local hunter-gatherers. They were newcomers. And for a time, they lived mostly separate lives. Archaeological sites linked to early farming cultures show distinct settlement patterns, permanent houses, organized villages, clear signs of agriculture, wheat, barley, domesticated animals. Meanwhile, hunter-gatherer communities continued their traditional lifestyle nearby. Two different ways of life, two different genetic backgrounds, coexisting in the same landscape, but not fully mixing, at least not at first. Because over time, that separation began to break down, and when it did, it created something entirely new. At first, the divide was clear. Farmers lived in permanent settlements, building longhouses, planting crops, raising animals. Hunter-gatherers moved through forests and rivers, hunting, fishing, and foraging like they had for thousands of years. Two populations, two lifestyles, two genetic worlds. But history has a pattern. When different human groups occupy the same land long enough, they don't stay separate forever. And in Poland, something gradual but deeply important began to happen. Contact, exchange, and eventually, mixing. Ancient DNA reveals that after the initial arrival of farmers, the genetic boundary between them and local hunter-gatherers started to blur. Not immediately, not evenly, but steadily. Over generations, the descendants of those Anatolian farmers began to intermarry with the local hunter-gatherers of Central Europe. And this is where the story becomes truly fascinating, because the mixing wasn't balanced at first. Early farming communities show very little hunter-gatherer ancestry. But later, that changes. By around 6,000 to 5,000 years ago, individuals buried in farming settlements across Central Europe, including Poland, show increasing levels of hunter-gatherer DNA, which tells us something important. The hunter-gatherers didn't disappear. They didn't vanish or get completely replaced. They survived, and more than that, they became part of the new society. But here's the surprising part. The influence didn't just go one way. This wasn't simply farmers absorbing hunter-gatherers. In some regions, the genetic contribution of hunter-gatherers becomes quite significant, sometimes even dominant in later populations, which suggests a more complex interaction, possibly even periods where farming populations declined and hunter-gatherer groups reasserted themselves. This is one of the biggest surprises revealed by ancient DNA. The spread of farming wasn't a clean, linear transition. It was messy, dynamic, unpredictable. Some farming communities thrived, others collapsed, and through it all, people mixed, adapted, and reshaped each other's genetic legacy. So by the late Neolithic period, the people living in what is now Poland were no longer purely Anatolian farmers, and they were no longer purely hunter-gatherers. They were something new, a blended population, carrying ancestry from both worlds. But even that wasn't the final chapter, because just as this new genetic balance was forming, another massive migration was already on the horizon, and this one would change everything again. Not gradually, but suddenly, and on a scale that would redefine the entire genetic landscape of Europe. Just as farming societies in what is now Poland were stabilizing, just as generations of mixing between farmers and hunter-gatherers had created a new balanced population, everything changed again. And this time, the change didn't come slowly. It came like a shockwave. From the vast grasslands north of the Black Sea, a region known as the Pontic-Caspian Steppe, a new group of people began to expand. They were mobile, pastoral, highly adaptable, and unlike earlier farmers, they moved fast. These were the people associated with what archaeologists call the Yamnaya culture, and their arrival in Europe around 5,000 years ago marks one of the most dramatic genetic transformations ever recorded in human history. Because this wasn't just another wave of migration, it was a near-total reshaping of populations. When scientists first analyzed ancient DNA from Bronze Age individuals across Europe, they found something astonishing. The genetic signature of these steppe populations appeared suddenly and spread rapidly. In many regions, including parts of Central and Eastern Europe, up to half, sometimes more, of the local ancestry was replaced within just a few hundred years. That is an incredibly fast change in genetic terms, and Poland was right in the middle of it. Before the steppe migration, the population of the region was mostly a mix of early farmers and hunter-gatherers.
Afterward, a third major ancestry component was added: steppe ancestry. And it didn't just blend quietly into the background, it became dominant in many areas. Now here's where things get even more interesting. This migration is strongly linked to the spread of Indo-European languages, the language family that includes most of the languages spoken in Europe today. Polish, like English, German, and many others, belongs to this family, which means part of the linguistic identity of Poland may trace back to these steppe migrants. Not directly, but through a chain of cultural and genetic influence that began with them. And just like before, this wasn't a simple story of replacement. Yes, the steppe migrants had a massive impact, but they didn't erase the past entirely. The descendants of farmers and hunter-gatherers were still there, still contributing, still mixing. What emerged after this period was a three-layered population: hunter-gatherer ancestry from the Ice Age inhabitants, farmer ancestry from Anatolian migrants, and steppe ancestry from Bronze Age pastoralists. This three-part genetic structure is still visible in modern Europeans today, including in Poland. But here's the key point.
Even after this massive transformation, the story still isn't over, because the identity we associate with Poland today, culturally, linguistically, historically, is tied to something that happens much later: the rise of Slavic-speaking populations. And this is one of the biggest debates in European history begins. When Slavic cultures appear in the archaeological record around the early medieval period, roughly the 5th to 7th centuries, they spread rapidly across Central and Eastern Europe, including Poland. The question that puzzled historians for generations was simple, but deeply controversial. Did these Slavic-speaking people come from somewhere else, replacing the existing population? Or were they already there, evolving from the people who had lived in the region for centuries? In other words, was it migration or continuity? For a long time, there was no clear answer. Archaeology could only tell part of the story. Artifacts changed, burial styles changed, settlements changed. But none of that could definitively prove whether the people themselves had changed. Then ancient DNA entered the picture, and for the first time, scientists could directly compare the genetic makeup of individuals from different time periods in the same region. What they found was unexpected. Early medieval individuals associated with Slavic culture in Poland were not drastically different genetically from the populations that lived there before them during the Late Bronze Age and Iron Age. That's a crucial point, because it suggests that the spread of Slavic identity in this region was not driven by a massive population replacement. Instead, it appears to have been largely a cultural transformation. The people didn't disappear, they changed. Their language shifted, their identity evolved, but genetically, there was continuity. Now, this doesn't mean there was no migration at all. There almost always is. Small groups move, ideas spread, cultures influence each other. But the scale matters. And in this case, the genetic evidence suggests that the majority of the population in Poland remained rooted in the same genetic base established after the Bronze Age. That base, the mixture of farmer, hunter-gatherer, and steppe ancestry, persisted, and over time, it became associated with a new cultural identity: Slavic. This is one of the most surprising conclusions from modern genetics research, because for years, the debate was framed as an either-or question. Either the Slavs came in and replaced the population, or they had always been there unchanged. But the truth appears to be more nuanced, more complex, and in some ways more interesting. There was change, but also continuity, movement, but also deep roots. And this layered history is exactly what makes the genetic origin of Poland's ancient farmers and their descendants so fascinating. Because their story doesn't end with farming. It continues through every migration, every cultural shift, every transformation that followed, all the way to the present. Today, when scientists look at the DNA of modern Polish people, they are not looking at something simple or pure in any historical sense. They are looking at a deep, layered archive of human history. Because inside modern Polish genetics, you can still find traces of every major chapter that came before. The Ice Age hunter-gatherers that once roamed the forests of Central Europe, the early farmers who arrived from Anatolia and brought agriculture to the continent for the first time, the Bronze Age steppe migrants from the Pontic-Caspian steppe who reshaped much of Europe's genetic landscape, and the later early medieval populations associated with the rise of Slavic culture. All of these layers are still present, not as separate groups, but as a combined genetic signature carried by modern Poles today. One of the most important discoveries in recent population genetics is that modern Europeans are not the descendants of a single ancient population. They are the result of repeated waves of migration, mixing, and transformation over thousands of years. And Poland is one of the clearest examples of this process, because it sits at the crossroads of Europe, geographically open, historically contested, and constantly reshaped by movement from all directions.
This is also why the story of Poland's ancient farmers matters so much. They were not just one isolated group in history. They were part of the first major transformation of European life, the shift from hunting and gathering to agriculture. But they were also part of something even larger, a chain reaction of migrations that continued long after farming began. And what makes this story truly fascinating is that none of these populations simply erased what came before. Instead, they built on top of each other, layer by layer, generation by generation. Now, here's the most honest scientific summary we can make today. The genetic origin of Poland is not a single origin at all. It is a convergence, a meeting point of ancient populations that came together over thousands of years. And the early farmers of Poland represent just one critical layer in that story. They were not the beginning of everything, and they were not the end of anything either. They were part of a much longer continuum of human movement across Europe. What ancient DNA has done is not simplify this story, but reveal its complexity. And that complexity changes how we understand identity itself, because it shows that populations are not fixed. They are dynamic, they evolve, they merge, they adapt, and they carry history inside their biology in ways we are only beginning to fully understand. So when we ask the question, what is the genetic origin of Poland's ancient farmers? The answer is no longer a single origin story. It is a network of origins, a layered history of migration, interaction, and transformation stretching back tens of thousands of years. And perhaps the most important takeaway is this: there is no such thing as a purely isolated European population, not in Poland, not anywhere. Every group is the product of ancient movement, every genome is a record of migration, and every population is, in some way, a living archive of human history. Poland's ancient farmers are not just a forgotten group buried in archaeological layers. They are part of the foundation of modern Europe. Their genes still exist today. Their story is still being rewritten. And as ancient DNA technology improves, we are likely to discover even more surprising chapters in the future, because this story is far from finished. It is still unfolding, right now, in the present. And that is what makes it so powerful. If you found this journey through time and genetics fascinating, make sure to like the video so more people can discover it. Subscribe for more deep documentaries on human origins, ancient DNA, and the hidden history written inside our genes. And now I want to ask you something. Did you expect Poland's genetic history to be this complex? Or did this change how you see European origins entirely? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.